Thank you all for attending. My name is Nitya Labh. I'm a junior at the College of William and Mary, and I'm excited to share my research with you today on Chinese land reclamation in the Pacific Islands. Many people are aware of China's construction of artificial islands in the South China Sea. This project takes from that idea and argues that China will export its island building capabilities around the world, namely in the Southwest Pacific. The Pacific Island countries, or PICs, are a series of 15 states spread across the Southwest Pacific. They include Fiji, Kiribati, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Solomon Islands, and Tuvalu. PICs, or PICs, face a near-term existential threat from climate change. These island countries are the most vulnerable region in the world to sea level rise, flooding, and wave inundation. Already, 8 islands have disappeared, and by 2050, 48 other islands are expected to follow. Migration is not an option for Pacific Island countries. PICs have an average elevation of 2 meters above sea level. This means, more often than not, there's no higher ground to move to. There's also a cultural significance and relationship between the people and their land. This means, on islands where there is higher ground, migration is unpopular and difficult. In addition, migrating out of their countries or towns creates major issues of sovereignty for Pacific Island states. Overall, migration is expensive, and there are a lot of bureaucratic challenges that prevent it from taking place. In addition, Pacific Island countries' political allegiances rely on climate action. A lack of climate action from traditional partners like the US and Australia has been received as a personal affront to the PICs. For example, after the US withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord, the director of Tuvalu's environmental ministry said, "I think they hate us." Instead, Pacific Islands are looking to China for climate assistance. According to the president of Kiribati, China is just more serious about the Paris Accords. China also recognizes that its ability to act on climate change for the Pacific Islands is critical to its regional influence. In response to the climate needs of these islands, China can offer its land reclamation services. China has a comparative advantage in land reclamation, conducting 1/3 of all global land reclamation projects in Shanghai alone. China also has the world's largest dredging fleet and continues to invest billions in these capabilities. China has also exported its land reclamation capabilities abroad, conducting projects in Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and Malaysia. Land reclamation is expensive, and that gives China economic leverage to build influence in Pacific Island countries where it conducts these projects. China can exercise this type of economic leverage through corruption and restrictive lending practices. Pacific Islands already struggle with debt. In fact, Tonga, Samoa, and Vanuatu are some of the most indebted countries in the world to China. Chinese land reclamation will therefore create conditions for serious debt sustainability problems in the future. With this type of leverage and expansionism, China can limit US power projection in the first and second island chain. By increasing their influence in the Pacific Islands, China can build power projection capabilities in the region and gain support for Beijing's political agenda among Pacific Island leaders. This influence and expansion would allow the PRC to threaten the US and allies' sea lanes of communication across the region, and creates a contested space in the Southwest Pacific. Currently, US policies aren't designed to address this type of threat. US aid is centered around capacity building, not climate infrastructure. The US lacks credibility on climate commitments in the region. And lastly, the US has compacts of free association with Palau, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. These compacts include defense agreements, which give the US authority over all land, water, and airspace for security and defense matters in these countries. The US also has the authority to prevent developments in these countries that represent a security threat. However, a lack of situational awareness in the Pacific Islands mean US policymakers haven't always used COFA authority to prevent Chinese expansionism. In response, the United States should consider highlighting and limiting problematic Chinese activity in the region. This begins with regional monitoring and intelligence gathering. The US could collaborate with its regional allies and PICs to share information and awareness about China's problematic activities. The US could engage in public diplomacy campaigns that increase international scrutiny towards China's influence in the region. Monitoring would also allow the US to provide effective legal assistance to PICs in land reclamation contract negotiations with China. Increased regional awareness also allows the United States to better engage in upcoming COFA renegotiations to reinforce its commitments to the region. Altogether, these measures limit avenues for China to gain influence in the PICs. Second, the United States should consider offering alternatives to Chinese land reclamation in the region. The United States can offer its own land reclamation projects to the Pacific Island countries. This would require expanding the U.S. dredging capacity both at home and abroad. The United States can collaborate with regional development partners like Australia, Japan, and Taiwan to create a multilateral lending compact to finance these land reclamation projects. By working with allies and partners in this lending program, the U.S. can offer an effective counter-response to China's Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, through which the PRC also builds influence in the PICs. In addition, the United States could act as guarantor for alternative land reclamation contracts. Contract guarantees help build investor confidence to encourage increased private sector participation. Lastly, U.S. construction already follows higher environmental and infrastructural standards. U.S. land reclamation in the region would create minimum standards for all island building projects, against which China would have to compete. Ultimately, the ability of the U.S. to respond to this type of threat requires it to operate along a continuum of competition, addressing both the climate needs of Pacific Island states and regional security concerns. As Beijing leverages land reclamation to challenge the legitimacy and presence of the U.S. in the Pacific, policymakers must consider new strategies to limit Chinese influence and create new options for Pacific Island states. Thank you.